The conservative movement gained adherents during the crises of the 1960s, despite Goldwater's defeat. Conservative writers insisted, first, that America's limited mission in Vietnam was doomed to failure. Having committed troops there, they should aim for victory, destroying North Vietnamese power rather than merely trying to prevent its spread to the south. Second, after fighting a rearguard on behalf of racial segregation, many of them accepted the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts of 1964-5, but opposed the rapid development of affirmative action programs, which they saw as a violation of the tradition of individual rights. Third, they deplored the rising youth culture on college campuses and the demonstrations and activism that often accompanied it. Equally bad, in their view, was the reluctance of liberal college administrators to repress it. Worst of all was the mass demonstrations of 1968, when, as they saw it, society was beginning to unravel. When civil order is threatened, they wrote, stern measures for the restoration of the law are the necessary first step, and in these conditions, repression can be a civilizing force. Under pressure of these events, National Review writer Frank Meyer re-emphasized the theory of fusionism, pointing out that the radical individualists, the traditionalists, and the anti-communists in the movement needed each other. They shared a common faith in civilization and a common objection to everything that American liberalism stood for. Never enthusiasts for Richard Nixon, they supported him in the presidential election of 1968, but would have preferred the new governor of California, Ronald Reagan. Most of the New Conservatives supported military action in Vietnam, but deplored what they saw as the half-heartedness of President Johnson's containment policy. Now, ever since the late 1940s, containment had been the standard Cold War approach. George Kennan, an influential policymaker, had proposed this policy. America should no longer draw back as it had done after the First World War. Instead, it should remain committed all around the world to preventing the further expansion of communism. Now that nuclear weapons made war catastrophically dangerous, America's policy must be to keep pressure on all the frontiers of the communist world in the hope and the expectation that eventually communism would unravel from its own internal contradictions, enabling the long crisis to pass. But from the Conservatives' point of view, that wasn't always good enough. William Buckley and James Burnham argued that the armed forces, once committed, should fight to win using all the weapons at their disposal. They continued to believe that America was involved in an all-out war with communism, that Ho Chi Minh was not merely a Vietnamese nationalist, and that a Viet Cong victory would be a Soviet victory as well. So, in their view, it was perfectly reasonable to take measures like bombing Hanoi, the principal city of North Vietnam, mining Haiphong Harbour, the principal harbour of the North, to prevent Soviet supply ships from coming in, and to take offensive actions into North Vietnam rather than merely trying to prevent the spread of North Vietnamese army power into the south and fight inconclusively against Viet Cong guerrillas in the south. In their view, the Americans had given themselves a mission which couldn't possibly prevail. Even as the war became more and more unpopular at the end of the 1960s, Buckley reminded readers that American credibility was at stake, and that if the United States backed away, it would be unable to assert its will in any other part of the world. Until the Tet Offensive of the early winter of 1968, a majority of Americans still supported the war. But after Tet, when it suddenly seemed that no Americans in Vietnam were safe, even in the cities, with the communist uprisings in Saigon and Hue, then suddenly American popular opinion began to turn more and more decisively against the war. But Buckley's point was, how can our allies in NATO and SEATO, the Asian treaty, how can they trust us if we demonstrate that we can't make our will prevail? The National Review conservatives overcame their preference for small government and for voluntarism and liberty to argue in favour of the draft, although this also remained a controversial point. Frank Meyer wrote, "The principle of universal military obligation is derived from the constitution of civil society, without which no human freedom could exist. But a free state has the right to enforce it only when such enforcement is the sole way to defend the structure of freedom itself, circumstances of paramount necessity. Well, of course, reasonable people could disagree about whether the American mission was circumstances of paramount necessity. So even in this defence of the draft, you can see Mayer having second thoughts and wondering about the reasonableness of so much energy for a place which might actually be peripheral to the main struggle. Two splinter groups, Murray Rothbard's Libertarians and L. Brent Bozell's Militant Catholics, disagreed with the war policy and particularly with the draft. Rothbard, who we met earlier, steadfastly denied that the Soviet Union and its communist allies posed an imminent threat to the United States, or that the Vietnam mission was justifiable. In fact, Rothbard and like-minded libertarians found themselves sympathising with parts of the American left in the 1960s. One of the most colourful figures in this period was Karl Hess, who'd previously been a principal speechwriter for Barry Goldwater, a great lover of liberty in the election of 1964. Rothbard and Hess together began to publish a journal called Left and Right, because they were struck by the paradox that the people who now agreed with them were the new left against the war. Here's what Karl Hess said. Conservatives like me had spent our lives arguing against federal power, with one exception. We trusted Washington with enormous powers to fight global communism. We were wrong, as Taft foresaw when he opposed NATO. Vietnam should remind all conservatives that whenever you put your faith in big government for any reason, sooner or later you end up as an apologist for mass murder. Hess and Rothbard and some of their friends for a while described themselves as anarcho-capitalists, and they had a kind of uneasy alliance with the anarcho-syndicalists on the extreme left. There's an extremely brilliant book about this by a man called Jerome Tucheli. Its title is It Usually Begins with Ayn Rand, and it describes the way in which a generation of young libertarians sometimes found themselves in strange alliances with the radical left at the time of the 1960s. That was one group of critics. Another group were the Triumph group. L. Brent Bozell, who I've mentioned several times already, the man who'd written Goldwater's book, The Conscience of a Conservative, founded Triumph magazine in 1966. And its intended audience was Orthodox Catholic conservatives. He was a convert to Catholicism. He'd married William Buckley's sister, Patricia, and converted, and was very serious indeed about his faith. In fact, he was dismayed by the Second Vatican Council of the early 1960s, which entailed many changes for Catholics, the end of the Mass being said in Latin, and the declaration of religious liberty. I mentioned in an earlier lecture John Courtney Murray, the Jesuit who wrote Dignitatis Humanae, as the name of the Vatican document. Because in Bozell's view, it was still better not to favour a policy of religious tolerance. He wanted to convert the heretics. But even so, he believed most of all in obedience to the teaching magisterium of the church, and he was determined to follow church teaching even when he had misgivings about it. For a while, Bozell had lived in Spain when Franco was still the dictator there. Support for Franco's Spain had been a great right-wing Catholic cause in the 1930s during the Civil War, which brought Franco to power. Bozell and some of his friends held summer schools at the Escorial Palace, King Philip II's vast mausoleum built in the late 1500s. Among his most enthusiastic supporters was Frederick Wilhelmsen, a professor of philosophy at the University of Dallas. And in Wilhelmsen's view, Spain was the spiritual centre of Christendom. Wilhelmsen wrote, "There is only one nation in history that has bested at arms both Islam and Marxism, and that nation is Spain. The crescent and the hammer and sickle. Ultimately, they have but one common enemy, the cross of Christ, and the civilization that took root and flourished from the wood of Golgotha." Well, that's a romantic flourish from Frederick Wilhelmsen, claiming that only Spain first defeated Islam in the Reconquista in the 1490s and then defeated communism in the Spanish Civil War. But anyway, Triumph magazine was dedicated to the full magisterium, following Catholic teaching wherever it might take them. Brent Bozell began to argue against the American role in Vietnam and to denounce American tactics because they didn't live up to Catholic teaching on just war theory. First of all, he didn't think the Tonkin Gulf resolution was adequate in terms of committing the nation to war, according to the theory. He was horrified by the assassination of General Diem, the South Vietnamese leader who was assassinated shortly before President Kennedy, and apparently with the acquiescence of President Kennedy himself. And by the late 1960s, there were widespread rumours that the American forces were using chemical warfare, such as defoliants, against the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And Bozell wrote, "There can be no equivocation. The use of chemical and biological warfare is absolutely forbidden a nation that wants to consider itself limited to morally just means of warfare. Christians today can and should fight for the good, but only with weapons and battle plans that seem pleasing to God." So he wasn't taking a pacifist position, but he was taking one which was consonant with Catholic just war teaching. Libertarians and Triumph, these Orthodox Catholics, were both a source of intense annoyance to fusionist conservatives like Buckley and Mayer and Burnham. Another big issue in the 1960s was the rise of black militancy after the peaceful phase of the civil rights movement. Conservatives feared the rise of black militancy in the wake of King's period of leadership in the movement. National Review conservatives condemned the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These are conventionally regarded as great landmarks in the history of the civil rights movement. But as National Review looked at them, they both had the effect of augmenting federal power and taking it away from the states. While the legislation was being prepared before it passed through Congress, Frank Mayer said this: "Almost every section of the 1964 Civil Rights Bill is directed towards destroying the constitutional balance of power and centering control over the lives of citizens in the hands of the chosen instruments of liberalism, the executive and a subservient Supreme Court." National Review then went on to express an acute dislike of affirmative action programs which began to develop in the 1960s. Because they substituted group rights for individual rights. The logic of affirmative action was that a citizen was going to be regarded in consideration for admissions to schools and admission to employment, not on the virtues of his or her particular qualities and abilities, but rather according to which racial group they happened to belong to. These conservatives also reacted to the rise of black militancy, particularly the Black Panthers, and met them with calls for repression. The summers of the 1960s were punctuated by violent riots in many of the inner cities. Detroit and Newark and Washington, D.C. itself suffered very, very severe property damage right in the heart of old cities. National Review explained these riots as attributable to the new militancy of black leaders like Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown, some of the Black Panthers, and other militants too. They also said this rioting had been prompted by the frustration of unrealistic hopes that liberal promises had raised, that many liberal activists had rashly promised that the many disadvantages which the African American population struggled with were simply now going to evaporate. And when they found that this wasn't the case, that getting the vote certainly wasn't a cure-all, they rioted in frustration against it. But of course, in retrospect, by 1968 or 69, it was already possible, even for conservatives, to look back nostalgically to the days of Martin Luther King, with his message of non-violent Christian love and his appeal to the heritage of Gandhi. A connected theme was that the new conservatives regretted the rapid European decolonisation of Africa, many of whose countries, they said, were ill-prepared for self-government. They regarded imperialism as having done far more good than harm in Africa, introducing Western technology, Christianity, medicine, education, and good roads. In their view, it was easy to balance the goods and bads of imperialism and find that, on balance, it was a good thing. They anticipated that the new African democracies were hopelessly frail and would soon succumb to military coups and tribal dictatorships, a prediction that soon proved true in almost every case. They also saw it as a place, Africa, as a place where Western influence was destined to shrink as communist influence grew, which again proved true in many former colonies, particularly the formerly Portuguese colonies of Mozambique and Angola. This was the period of the Cold War when the Soviet Union and the American government were both casting about to get as many sympathetic allies as they could. And new post-colonial nations were sometimes able to play the Americans and the Russians off against each other, getting aid and mutual assistance. Well, because of National Review's general approval of imperialism and general deploring of the abandonment of Africa to its fate, they were much less censorious than most American opinion about Rhodesia and South Africa, which were the two remaining white supremacist regimes inside Africa. On the other hand, they were genuinely horrified by the brutality of South African apartheid and the escalating repression with which it was maintained, the periodic massacres carried out by the white police force, and similarly by white French terrorism in the Algerian War of Independence. Now, normally National Review had an extremely confident tone of voice, but facing this problem they had a very uncharacteristic tone of genuine bafflement and horror. Here's a 1962 editorial in which National Review wrote, "We confess with deep and troubled humility our failure to comprehend this dreadful problem of terror that has become a pervasive quality of our epoch. Before the problem of terror, the mind plunges into a metaphysical despair, as before those other dark dilemmas that have so long weighed on man's spirit." I think that's a demonstration that they were in fact taking these questions very, very seriously and were agonised over how adequately to resolve them. Now, another source of discontent to the Conservatives during the 1960s was the activism of the Supreme Court under the leadership of Chief Justice Earl Warren. This appeared to be to the Conservatives, this appeared to be further upsetting national stability, especially with its decisions relating to religion and the First Amendment. In two important decisions in 1962 and 1963, praying in public schools was prohibited, and so was Bible reading, and so was the recitation of the Ten Commandments. Conservatives lamented these decisions because they had a secularising effect. And for many of these Conservatives, the Cold War had a big religious dimension, that it was actually the war of Christendom against atheism. So they said, this is the worst possible time in which to strip away the religious protections and the public religious affirmations of American history. And they said, getting rid of prayer and Bible reading and the Ten Commandments in schools violates a long tradition of prayer and Bible reading. Even a very carefully worded prayer, the Regent's Prayer in the state of New York, was prohibited, even though the Regents had been very careful to word it in such a way that no particular religious grouping was offended. Even so, the prayer was found to be unconstitutional, according to the way in which the Warren Court interpreted the First Amendment. Now, once again, one of the most important figures in this controversy was Brent Bozell. He published a book in 1966 called The Warren Revolution. And it was the first of many late 20th century conservative broadsides against judicial activism. Bozell argued that the Supreme Court judges were making the law in religion, in civil rights, particularly the Brown case, in the rights of alleged subversives in cases arising out of McCarthyism, in election redistricting, and that sometimes in making the law they were completely ignoring long traditions of precedent, which was supposedly the very thing the Supreme Court must never do. Bozell wrote, during the past 12 years, the Supreme Court, with the encouragement of the country's intellectual establishment, has instituted a new kind of constitution making, which is revolutionary both in its method and in its consequences. It sought to transfer the solution of some of the most momentous problems of contemporary public policy by judicial decree. A more explicit repudiation of the underlying assumptions of the constitutional government can hardly be imagined. Another source of anxiety to the Conservatives was the youth culture of the 1960s, and particularly the unrest in American universities. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, American university campuses have grown very, very rapidly, first in response to the GI Bill after World War II, and then in a more affluent society in response to the fact that more and more members of each generation could afford to send their children to college, and that credentialing became necessary for good work. The Vietnam War intensified that effect because young men soon discovered that they could get a draft deferment if they were going to college. You'd be called up to the army as soon as you left high school unless you were going into college. And suddenly all kinds of young men who hadn't previously been particularly studious suddenly found in themselves a great thirst for higher education. On the campuses themselves, there was an uprising of student activism. It began with the Berkeley free speech movement in the fall of 1964, when the students protested against not being allowed to express their political views and to campaign for their candidates freely on campus. Then followed demonstrations at Columbia, in New York, at Cornell, at Harvard, and many other, particularly of the elite universities. Sometimes with the students occupying the libraries or the administration buildings and trying to bring the ordinary work of education to a standstill until their demands were met. They demanded a more relevant curriculum, one addressing the problems of their world. The abolition of parietal rules, according to which they had curfews, boys and girls weren't allowed in each other's dormitories, and the university was standing in the position of a parent over them. They wanted more contact with the surrounding communities. And very often they wanted the universities to detach themselves from the Vietnam War by abolishing ROTC and refusing to let university researchers take on military research projects. Well, very often the university administrators reacted to these kinds of demands very, very cautiously, treating the students with kid gloves, conciliating the radical leaders rather than confronting them. William Buckley, who was a fixture on the college debate circuit, was dismayed by the occupations and by the disruption of unpopular speakers on campus, and particularly by the weak administrators' responses. As you might expect, he was one of these speakers who got a rough handling from several student audiences. And in his regular column in National Review, he once described how he'd been forced to abandon a speech after heckling from Students for a Democratic Society, SDS people, was so loud and continuous and deafening that it was literally impossible for him to be heard. So he left the stage, and the apologetic student leader who'd invited him in the first place told Buckley that the administration of the college would not act against the radicals. Buckley wrote this: "There's nothing at all wrong with the overwhelming majority of the students, whose intimidation is less the result of the raucous minority than the result of the intellectual and moral abdication of their faculty and deans." As in the inner cities, so on the campuses. Sometimes law and order must come first. Buckley wrote, "Policemen are, in certain circumstances, precisely the agents of civilization and humanity. Their availability is something that the forces of reason and enlightenment should celebrate rather than deplore." One of the most famous incidents of public demonstration in the 1960s was the riotous scenes surrounding the hotels where the Democratic National Convention took place in Chicago in 1968. And they were widely regarded at the time by journalists and commentators as premonitions of anarchy and social breakdown. The sociologist Robert Nisbet was increasingly sympathetic to the conservative position, and he believed that, sure enough, society was becoming completely ungovernable. He wrote early in the 1970s about the 60s, "I think it would be difficult to find a single decade in the history of Western culture when so much barbarism, so much calculated onslaught against culture and convention in any form, and so much sheer degradation of both culture and the individual passed into print, into music, into art, and onto the American stage. The revolt against authority, the consecration of disorder, waste, and anarchy in traditional society, these are indeed icons of all left intellectuals at the present time." Well, the early political career of Ronald Reagan demonstrated that conservatives were going to be the long-term beneficiaries of the 60s. But before talking about the early days of Reagan's career, let me just say a word about Buckley himself as a candidate. He ran a political campaign for mayor of New York in 1965, which he lost, but which brought him further publicity and respect. When he began to campaign, Buckley decided he wasn't going to act like a normal candidate. He had the liberty to do this because he knew he was going to lose the election. He wouldn't join a Polish parade. He wouldn't eat blintzes when he went to a Jewish district. Both his running mates were Irish Catholics. He wasn't going to attempt to have an ethnic balance on his slate. In fact, he argued that bloc politics insulted people into stereotypes of themselves, and that to satisfy an ethnic bloc did not help the actual members of the bloc. His two rivals, the Republican John Lindsay and the Democrat Abraham Beame, were both very, very serious men, and Buckley consistently ridiculed them with witticisms in debate when they were grimly serious. When it came to the point, Lindsay, the moderate Republican, won with 1.3 million votes, whereas Buckley got 340,000. A respectable showing, but nevertheless an obvious loss. He then wrote a lovely book about the campaign called The Unmaking of a Mayor, published in 1966, and it's one of the most entertaining political books of the entire decade of the 60s. One incident in the campaign which he recalls fondly is this. A journalist says, "Now, what are you going to do if you're declared the winner?" And Buckley said, "I'm going to demand a recount." In other words, nothing could be less likely than that he was going to win. The book and the campaign made him a major national celebrity and prompted the creation of Firing Line, his political chat show, which ran for the next 30 years, and also contributed to the mainstreaming of conservatism. Now let's move on to Ronald Reagan. Reagan was a movie star in the 1930s and 40s, and he'd cooperated with Hollywood McCarthyism because he'd been the head of the Screen Actors Guild at the time when the House Committee on Un-American Activities went to Hollywood in search of Hollywood communists. He helped to purge the communists by active cooperation with HUAC, the House Committee. He believed that communists were agents of a foreign power and that they ought not to work in the industry. Reagan had then moved into TV in the early 1950s, getting on board a new technology quite early, just as he'd moved from radio to Hollywood in the 1930s. He made a speech on behalf of Barry Goldwater during the primaries and during the last days of the campaign of 1964, and it drew widespread notice in the Republican Party because Reagan, a very, very practiced public figure who'd been in the limelight for 30 years, was very good at making convincing speeches. In the speech, Reagan said he'd switched from his family's Democratic New Deal loyalty, with which he'd grown up, because of fears of overmighty government and the sinister movement towards total government, which had seemed possible. He hit all the major Goldwater themes and made many of them sound rather sinister. But at the same time, he backed them with his easy, folksy style. Reagan was very good at presenting conservatism with a sense of relaxation. He said, "We are at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. There is only an up or down. Up to man's age-old dream, the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with law and order. Or down to the ant-heap totalitarianism. And regardless of their sincerity, their humanitarian motives, those who would trade our freedom for security have embarked on this downward course." Well, the speech played so well that it led the kingmakers of the Republican Party to offer Reagan the chance to run for the governorship of California in 1966. He campaigned against the radical students at Berkeley and found it to be a very resonant issue with many of the voters, the taxpayers, who resented, as they saw it, paying for this unrest. And he won an upset against Edmund Brown Sr., the Democratic incumbent who'd underestimated Reagan and who'd thought of him as a political lightweight. Reagan discovered that Berkeley was a vivid vote-getting issue. And as the governor, he sent in the National Guard in May 1969 during the intense and violent controversy over the future of People's Park. Another California educator had the same experience. S.I. Hayakawa, a professor of semantics, whom Reagan appointed as president of San Francisco State College in 1968. He became a hero to conservatives during a student strike. SDS, the Black Panthers, and the Third World Liberation Front led a student strike demanding an end to racism, an end to the Vietnam War, and a new Black Studies department, and they tried to close the campus down. Hayakawa was determined to keep it open, refused to be intimidated, call in the police, and on one occasion jumped onto a sound truck and pulled out the wires to prevent sound amplification of the students' speeches. This also played very well politically and led to his being rewarded with a successful run for the US Senate in 1976. All these signs that standing up to the radicals made good electoral sense was a message not to be lost on the Republican Party strategists in the 1970s. And in the politics of the 70s, these new activist conservatives became a more and more important part of the party's work.